Adrian came back to life on stone. Not gently, not by degrees. The cavern returned him the way surf hurled wreckage ashore, with force enough to make breath feel like injury. Water tore out of him in a brutal rush. He rolled onto one elbow, coughing, ribs burning, throat scraped raw. It had not reached the cavern kindly. Thin seams of blue-gray light leaked through cracks high above, enough to prove the hour was early, not enough to warm anything they touched. The light bled over wet rock and died there. Most of the chamber remained a half-world of silvered edges, black hollows, and hidden depth. Adrian dragged one shaking hand over his face and forced himself upright. His head throbbed, his lungs still burned, his shoulder felt as though something enormous had used it for leverage. But he was alive, and the fact reached him not as gratitude, but as urgency. Memory struck all at once, the boat shattering in the throat, water wrenching them apart, the black beneath the hull, that shape turning where nothing that large should have been able to turn. Corvin! The name tore out of him before thought could interfere. It struck stone, broke against the chamber's partitions, and came back in pieces. Corvin. Then nothing. He swallowed against the pain in his throat and tried again louder. Corvin! No answer. Ines! That fared no better. The cavern did not give him silence exactly. It gave him fragments of himself and nothing human in return. He made himself look. He lay on a slanted shelf of black rock, slick with water and pale mineral sheen, one broken ledge in a much larger chamber. It might have been 100 feet across at its widest visible reach, but it did not open cleanly. Thick buttresses of stone divided one section from the next. Split shelves, wet curtains of mineral, and jutting black ribs of rock concealed more than they revealed. It did not feel like one room. It felt like one exposed piece of a much larger stone body.
Above him, the ceiling lifted into fractured dark. Below, lower channels moved through breaks in the rock, black water slipping and dragging where he could glimpse it. No roar, only a hidden, steady movement, as though the cave breathed through its own blood. And under even that lay something worse, the sense that the lower water had depth enough to keep secrets and movement enough to turn them in the dark. He pushed his feet too quickly. The chamber lurched, cold light smeared. He caught the wall and stood bent for a moment until the dark pressing at the edges of his sight thinned again. That was when he saw the body. One of Vale's crew had been flung farther along the shelf and wedged crooked between two slabs of black stone where the flood had thrown him and left him. The man's neck bent wrong. One arm had folded under him in a way no living joint would bear. Blood had washed thinly over the stone around his shoulder and side. His coat had torn there, and beneath the rip, the flesh looked wrong in a way Adrian could not cleanly blame on rock alone. He stopped dead. Relief came first, swift and shameful. Not Corvin, not Ines. The cave was already killing. Adrian crouched, forcing his mind back to use. The crewman's face was slack with death, not familiar enough for a name. Adrian checked him anyway. A knife still hung at the man's belt. Adrian took it. An oiled striker, a short length of cord, nothing else worth saving. "Forgive me," he muttered, though the apology felt thinner than air. He rose with the knife in hand and shouted again. "Corvin!" Still nothing, only dripping, and the low, hidden slip of water. No boots, no voice, no answer from above or below. He had to move. Height first, he thought. Sight first. If the others had survived anywhere within hearing, a better vantage might find them where shouting had failed. He started along the shelf. The footing was treacherous from the start. Water glazed the stone. Pale mineral crust feathered the seams like frost. One narrowing run slanted down beside a jut of rock into a darker lower pocket. Above, the ledge ended in blind wall. Below, the dark opened into another chamber reach. Adrian tested the sloping run with his boot once, then again with more care. Moss. Slick. Too slick. He crouched, picked up a fist-sized chip of stone, and tossed it down the incline. It skidded fast and vanished into the pocket below without a sound large enough to trust. He studied the slope again. A hanging root, thin as cord, trailed down beside it. A narrow seam in the rock gave better purchase a hand's width to the left. If he went low, used the seam, and kept his weight back, he might cross, or at least look down safely. He tightened the cord once around his wrist, so he would not lose the knife if he slipped. No answer came to his next call, but his own voice, smaller now. He started down, careful, one boot set sideways, one hand on the seam, the other holding the knife low. The rock gave him nothing. His foot shot out, the seam turned slick under his palm. For one furious instant he thought he had it, then the whole slope went from difficult to impossible beneath him, and he slid down a rush of cold water, moss and loose grit. He hit once with one shoulder, then with his hip, and came to rest hard against a rough lip of stone at the bottom. Pain flashed white through him. The pocket was darker than the chamber above, but not blind. A dim underlight lived in it. Clusters of low mushrooms rooted in damp cracks, their caps giving off a corpse-pale glow, blue-white in some places, greenish in others. The weak light silvered wet stone, caught on thin hanging growths that descended through cracks like translucent roots, and turned old shed skins pale as discarded gloves where they lay among the rocks. It might have been beautiful if beauty had not felt so carefully trapped there. The pocket held warmth, too, a sealed breath of hidden heat. The cold morning of the upper chamber did not fully reach this place. It felt like a buried world that had taught itself to glow because the sun had never come. Then Adrian saw the shed skins properly. Too many, longer than they should have been, and lying near them a faint wavering line in the moss where something had moved recently. He went still. Snake pocket. His stomach dropped so hard it almost emptied him. For one stupid flashing instant, he was back on the cliff with that baby thing on his shoulder, already halfway into Corvin's arms before pride could reach him. This was no baby. This was a nest. Panic hit him clean and fast. His body wanted to scramble. He did not let it. Not because he was calm, because fast movement here would kill him. He saw the first one half-coiled in a crack, dark-bodied and lacquer black in the low light, with a cold inner shimmer pulsing beneath translucent scales like drowned fire trapped under glass. Narrow, broken bars of blue-white luminescence ran down his spine, brightening when it moved and dimming when it stilled. Another lay near a warm patch of rock. A third had lifted its head just enough to show him the wedge of it against the dark. Adrian stopped breathing for a beat. Then he made himself breathe shallowly instead. "Don't bolt," he thought wildly. "Don't bolt." He shifted the knife into a grip he did not trust and used it to drag one dry shed skin toward him. The nearest snake tracked the motion at once. Good. Let it look there. Let it look anywhere but at him. He flicked the skin to the far side of the pocket. Two heads turned. Adrian rose slowly, one boot on the slope, one hand on the seam. He found the hanging root with his other hand and tested it once. It held. He got another step upward and another. The fourth snake struck from higher slope in the moss beside his right leg, hidden where the warmth met shadow. Pain snapped through him just above the knee, a hard, burning puncture, sharp enough to tear a sound out of him before he fully understood what had happened. He looked down in horror and caught only the flash of drowned white light vanishing back into the moss-dark crack. The burning spread inward, as if the flesh under the bite had been packed with heat and lit. Adrian gasped and climbed harder, but his fingers had already begun to forget themselves. Numbness rushed into both hands, even as the wound burned hotter. The cold air no longer felt cold enough. His head thudded once, then again. He got one hand higher. The rock tilted beneath him. His vision blurred. Morning light smeared white and gray over black stone. The pain in his thigh became pulse, then furnace. His limbs went heavy, in the same breath they went unreliable. "Corvin!" Then Adrian lost the slope altogether and slid back down, striking one shoulder hard on the way, until he came to rest where he had started, cheek against wet stone, breath too hot, heart hammering wildly against a body that no longer felt fully his. The snakes had vanished from immediate sight. He thought, absurdly, of daylight still existing somewhere beyond the fissures overhead, of Corvin alive somewhere in the cave and not knowing where Adrian had gone. The burning climbed higher. His fingers were numb now. His head pounded. Heat climbed through him, and his fingers no longer felt like his own. The last thing he felt clearly was the wet stone under his cheek and the furious heat moving through his blood. Then the pale morning light blurred into nothing. Corvin came back to life in heat. He hit the stone shelf on hands and knees, coughed once, and brought up enough water to sheet blackly across the rock between his palms. The second breath tore, the third steadied. By the fourth, he was already looking for who else had survived. His chamber was not Adrian's. This reach sat lower and breathed warmer, its air thick with mineral heat rising through fissures and black water runs below. It was still morning, that much, the light filtering down through upper cracks made plain, but the light here arrived thinner and meaner before it touched stone. Wet walls rose in shelves and broken tiers. A deeper cut of water moved through the middle with a low, ugly assurance that made mistrust instinctive. So was the smell, not only seawater and rock, but something furnace-breathed beneath, as if the cavern kept a hotter body buried deeper in its own dark. He lifted his head and saw Ines. She lay half-turned against a rise of rock where the current had thrown her, dark hair plastered across her face, mouth slack, chest still. He was beside her in 3 strides. "Ines!" Nothing. He rolled her, found nothing at her throat he trusted, and got to work. No softness, no ceremony. He forced water from her lungs the way seamen did when gentleness had already lost its chance. Once, twice. He struck hard between her shoulders. On the third blow she convulsed and coughed black water across both of them. "There," Corvin said roughly. "Stay in the world." Ines dragged in a breath like something she intended to resent and twisted at once, one hand going for a knife no longer at her belt. Even half drowned, she woke dangerous. "If you say that again, I'll bite." "Good." A frightened sound farther down the shelf turned both their heads. One of Vale's crew had survived too, wedged against a mineral pillar with one ankle twisted badly beneath him, breathing in quick, hard jerks, as if each inhale required argument. Corvin checked the ankle with one look. "You can limp." The man swallowed. "Aye." By then, Ines had pushed herself up and spat the last of the water from her mouth. "Where are the others?" "Whitcomb wasn't in our boat," she said. "He had the one behind us. The other two were farther back." Corvin looked across the chamber, measuring breaks, shelves, black runs, and bad options. Then if they got through clean, Whitcomb and the others should have come into the central reach, not here. Guessing would not improve the field. He turned to the chamber itself. The lower water moved wrong. Not because it was narrow. Narrow water had a language he knew. This was different. One black run looked still, but left too fresh a wash mark on the stone. Another moved too fast around a spur for its depth. In the deepest cut, where the heat rose strongest, the current seemed to hesitate and gather again, as though something large turned slowly in it beyond sight. He saw pale scoring on the rock near that darkest cut. Something bone-white lay farther along beneath the mineral lip where the water had dropped it. Inez saw his face change. "What?" Corvin kept his gaze on the lower channel another beat. "This chamber is used." Corvin ignored him and raised his voice once into the broken dark. "Adrian!" The name came back in torn pieces. No answer. "Whitcomb." Still nothing human returned. Dead elsewhere, alive elsewhere, or cut off by the cavern's divided body. None of those answers improved anything. Corvin snatched up a length of broken wood and hurled it into the nearest lower run. It caught at once, spun hard, and vanished around the stone spur faster than the surface had promised. Corvin pointed with his chin toward the rise, angling away from the lower cut. "We go up if we can. We keep off the black runs unless the cave leaves us no choice. Put your feet where I tell you, and nowhere else." The crewman nodded immediately. Corvin had barely turned toward the rise when a scream tore through the rock. Human, brief, cut off hard. All three froze. Then the pistol shot cracked through the cavern. It came broken by stone, but hard enough to kill all doubt. The report slammed off the chamber walls and returned in ugly echoes, making the whole hot, dark sound suddenly full of guns. Inez's head snapped toward it. "Pistol!" Corvin was already moving. "This way!" He climbed for the chamber break without waiting to see whether the others followed. They had no better choice than to do it. Diego found Adrian by following the scream. At first he saw only the dark smear of wetness where the moss-slicked incline dropped into another pocket of the cave. Then he saw Adrian himself, crumpled at the bottom on one side, one hand half curled uselessly near his face. "Adrian!" No answer. Diego slid down the last of the slope with one hand braced against the rock and landed hard enough to jar his knees. The pit was warmer than the chamber above, and lit only by that sick fungus glow Adrian had already learned to hate. Wet stone, shed skins, hanging pale growths, enough to see, more than enough to distrust. Then came the rasp, dry, close, mineral. Diego turned sharply and saw the snake half-coiled near Adrian's legs, dark as wet lacquer, except where a pale, cold shimmer moved beneath the scales. Broken bars of blue-white light ran down its spine, dim in stillness, flaring when it shifted. It had raised just enough of itself to strike again. He drew and fired on instinct. The shot cracked through the pit like a split skull. Flame leapt at the muzzle. The snake thrashed violently against stone and vanished among the cracks. The report slammed upward through the cavern in broken echoes. Diego did not wait to see whether the thing was dead. He dropped beside Adrian and rolled him carefully enough not to worsen whatever the fall had already done. Adrian's skin was cold with cave damp, but fever had begun to burn beneath it. His breathing came fast and shallow. Diego found the pulse racing at his throat. Alive. His gaze moved lower and found the bite quickly, 2 punctures high on the right thigh, cloth darkening around them, the flesh already flushing and bruising towards blue-black. Snake, then. Bad one. He looked around once, no other bodies in sight, only the warm pit, the glow, the cracks, the climb back up. He got one arm under Adrian's shoulders and another beneath his knees, tried to lift him, failed at the angle, cursed, then hauled him onto his back instead, Adrian's limp arm slung over his shoulders, fever weight riding him like something the cave meant to keep. Come on, you are not dying in a hole. The climb back up was uglier than the descent. Moss slid under his boots. Twice he nearly lost them both. Adrian made one small broken sound against his shoulder, but did not wake. By the time Diego reached the upper shelf, his own breath had gone hard in his chest. He carried Adrian farther until he found a broad enough shelf to hold them and dry enough dead growth to coax a fire alive. It sat between chamber reaches, a narrow shelf where one man might work and another fail at dying. Diego worked quickly. Dry root fiber, dead cave growth, torn cloth, a little oil. A mean orange flame caught at last and shivered over the black stone. Then he fetched water from a drip line in the wall and came back to Adrian. "Wake for me." Adrian swallowed only a little. Most of it ran down his chin and throat. His lashes fluttered once without opening. The wet clothes had to come off, that much was true. Diego peeled back the soaked coat first, then worked the shirt open and away from Adrian's skin, both to free him from the cold wet cloth and to see how far the venom had run. Adrian shivered once under his hands and then sagged again, too weak and fevered to resist. The little fire moved over Adrian's body in pulses. Even half-conscious with fever, he still looked offensively untouched by the world around him. Pale skin against black rock, white hair damp at the temples, fine bones. Beauty alone would not have done it. Adrian was wanted, by veil for his mind, by scandal because ruin looked prettier in his face, by Corvin in that blunt, murderous way that shut other men out before they had spoken. Something mean in Diego answered at once. Not tenderness, but the thrill of finding something prized unguarded, the vanity of touching what another man would tear the world apart to reclaim. He gave Adrian more water, wiped what spilled from his throat with the heel of his hand, and let the hand stay there. He listened once toward the dark mouth of the shelf. No boots, no voices, only distant dripping and the low, hidden slip of water somewhere deeper in the rock. His vest hit the stone beside him. He bent closer. Adrian's breath caught wrong. Then his body seized. Not a full convulsion yet, a hard, ugly pull through the limbs and chest that arched him halfway off the stone. Blood touched his lower lip. A ragged sound tore out of him. Diego jerked back as if struck. For one clean second he only stared. Then calculation came back, sharp as panic. Vale had not paid him for a corpse. He dragged Adrian upright against him and wiped the blood away with the heel of his hand, then cursed when another smaller shudder ran through him. Adrian's pulse, when Diego snatched for it, raced thin and wild under the skin. No, don't die now. He pulled Adrian closer to the little fire, forced more water at his mouth, rubbed warmth back into his hands. Adrian coughed again, weaker now, blood streaking his lower lip. His lashes fluttered. A sound escaped him, hardly a word. Diego bent closer despite himself. "Corvin," Adrian whispered. Diego went still. Of course, he thought. Even like this, you reach for him first. He got his vest back on with clumsy haste, then dragged Adrian's shirt roughly into place, not properly dressed, only enough to make the scene read right if anyone came on them. Fire, Water, rescue, urgency, nothing else. The echoes of the pistol shot had scarcely died when voices answered through the rock. "Here!" Diego shouted at once. "Over here!" Boots came hard along the higher break. Inez reached them first. She dropped to one knee beside Adrian, one hand already at his throat, the other braced on the stone. Her eyes moved once over Adrian's face, the fever burn in him, the little fire, the water. Then her gaze shifted to Diego. His belt sat crooked. The fall of his breeches had been dragged back into order too hastily to look natural. He looked too aroused, too little like a man who had only hauled someone out of a snake pit. Inez looked back to Adrian. His clothes had been pulled into place no better. His shirt hung open lower than it needed to for the bite, one side twisted, fastenings missed. Inez went very still. "What happened?" she asked. Diego answered too quickly. "He fell into a snake pocket below. I heard him cry out, found him in the pit, shot one of the things off him, and got him up here." Corvin and one of Vale's crew reached them a breath later. He crossed the last of the distance and dropped beside Adrian with all speed and frightening control. His hand went first to Adrian's face. Burning. "What happened?" Diego answered again, cleaner this time. "He fell into a snake pocket below. I heard him cry out, found him in the pit, shot one of the things off him, and got him up here." Corvin's gaze dropped to the bite and the ugly color climbing around it. His jaw tightened once, hard. Adrian stirred at Corvin's touch. His lashes trembled for one brief second. His eyes opened to fever-bright slits and found Corvin by instinct rather than sight. "Corvin," he whispered. "I'm here," he said. Adrian's fingers twitched weakly toward him and failed. As Corvin bent over Adrian, Inez rose, caught Diego by the arm, and dragged him 2 steps back into the shadow of the shelf break. Her voice came low and flat, meant for him alone. "Whatever stupidity you started here ends now." Diego's mouth twitched. "You overestimate my opportunities." Inez's grip tightened. "He is Vale's instrument," she said, "not your amusement. Touch him for yourself again, and I'll open you before she can decide whether you were still useful." Then Inez let him go. Whitcomb came through the break next, sword in hand, the physician just behind him, with the myth professor, the antiquary, and 2 of Whitcomb's men. The physician took in the shelf at a glance, the fire, the water, Adrian in Corvin's arms, and went straight to the wound. "Hold him steady." Corvin's grip tightened at once. Inez dropped to one knee on Adrian's other side and braced his shoulder before the next tremor could throw him. The physician checked pulse, throat, breath. He peeled the cloth farther back from the bitten thigh and frowned at once. "What bit him?" Diego answered first. Dark-bodied, almost black, pale light under the scales, as if the thing carried moonfire in its skin. Broken bars down the spine. It lit when it moved. Bit him high in the thigh. I shot one in the pit. The myth professor looked up sharply. "No common adder carries light under the skin. There are old channel accounts, buried water serpents, lantern vipers, some mariners called them. I thought it was sailors frightening children." "No common adder, then," the physician said. Whitcomb's jaw set. "What does that mean?" The physician wasted no words. "Too fast bruising, too much fever, numbness, then convulsion, blood at the mouth, wrong order. I do not know this species, and I do not like what it is doing."
Adrian shuddered again in Corvin's arms, a smaller pull this time, but vicious enough to tighten his whole frame. His breath hitched. "Hold him." Corvin's hand went at once to the back of Adrian's neck, keeping his head from striking stone if the spasm worsened. Inez pinned his shoulder more firmly. The tremor passed after a few brutal seconds, leaving Adrian slack again and breathing too fast.
Corvin's voice came low and dangerous. "Will he live?" "I do not know," the physician said. "If he seizes again and loses the breath, he won't." Whitcomb looked from the wound to the physician. "Can he be moved?" "He must be. Warm, higher, and fast enough to matter. Keep him breathing. Keep his head from striking stone if he convulses." Whitcomb took one look at Corvin holding Adrian and did not waste time trying to pry him loose. "Central chamber behind us. More room, more light. If we hold here, we're fools." Corvin slid one arm under Adrian's shoulders and the other beneath his knees and lifted him from the stone. "Move," Whitcomb snapped. And with Adrian in Corvin's arms, the physician at his shoulder, and the cave breathing wrong all around them, they turned toward the higher dark and the road back to the central chamber. Outside, beyond the hidden throat and the waterfall's lie, the flagship waited where the basin permitted waiting, and no more. Vale stood on the quarterdeck, with one gloved hand on the rail. The corsair stood 2 paces behind her, still enough to seem carved from cloth and shadow. The basin below lay cold and dim under morning sky, a black bowl of water, ringed by cliff and white fall. No signal had come from the cave in several minutes. Vale did not pace, she did not fidget, but she listened. The officer at the rail lowered the glass. "Nothing from the entry line, my lady." Again. The signalman raised and lowered the flag. No answer came. Then, faint even at this distance, the shot cracked from inside the rock. One of the men at the rail flinched. Vale did not. Adrian dead meant the key closed again. Corvin dead meant the only pilot she trusted to read murderous water was gone. She would not spend a second boat merely to feed the cave more men and call it resolve. "Boat crews ready," she said. "Not sent, ready." The officer hesitated. "My lady, if they need immediate aid." "If they need immediate aid," Vale said mildly, "panic will not improve it." The corsair's head turned fractionally toward the cave mouth. Vale went on, still calm. "You will hold them at the throat unless line or signal tells you otherwise. I will not lose another boat blind." The officer bowed and ran. Whitcomb's lamp and the physician's smaller flame threw a broken traveling light that caught wet stone in strips and left the deeper reaches black. The chamber was broader than the shelves behind them, but only a fool would have called it safe. Right was height. Left was water. The middle shelf where they entered connected the two. Corvin came on to that middle shelf carrying Adrian. The others spilled in around him by fits and starts. Whitcomb ahead on the right with lamp and sword, Corvin in the center with Adrian, the physician close at his shoulder, Inez just left of them, Diego behind with pistol in hand, the scholars scrambling after the armed men, and Whitcomb's 2 surviving men stringing themselves between terror and obedience. The physician pointed with his chin. "Higher, keep him off the lower air if you can." Whitcomb swept the lamp across the rise to the right. For one brief sweep, the light caught a shelf tucked beneath a black mineral overhang, drier than the rest. Something sat there, not loose stone, not drift, a dark bowl of twisted branches lodged into the rock. In its center, something pale and narrow gleamed once through the wet dark. "The nest," the antiquary breathed. Whitcomb's jaw hardened. "That shelf, move." Corvin was already doing it.
His boots struck wet stone in hard, controlled steps. Adrian gave no sign that he knew any of it. Only his breathing proved he remained in the world, shallow and too fast. The sound came from the lower left run. Then the lower dark rose. Black water surged behind them in one sudden, impossible swell, and out of it came a tentacle so vast the mind refused it for a beat. It coiled around Corvin's leg and yanked. The breath went out of the shelf. Corvin nearly lost Adrian then and there. His shoulder struck the rock. Water burst white around his boots. He slammed down hard and caught the broken edge beside him with one hand before the thing below could drag him fully in. The coil tightened. He kicked at it once hard and got nothing for the effort but a worse pull. Whitcomb was already there. Corvin did not waste the moment. He drove Adrian toward him with both arms. Whitcomb caught Adrian high against his chest. Then a second tentacle came. It lashed out of the black water with the speed of a whip and struck Whitcomb full across the body. One instant he was there with Adrian in his grip. The next he was gone, flung sideways into the dark. Adrian hit the stone hard. He coughed once, twice. Blood spilled bright from his mouth across the black rock. Diego shouted and fired both pistols into the boiling water below. The shots cracked through the chamber and came back from the stone in shattered echoes. Then, for one impossible second, everything stilled. The water smoothed. The chamber held. Corvin was still there, one hand locked white on the rock, the black coil wound round his leg, the rest of him dragged low over the edge. He looked at Adrian. "Can you stand, Adrian?" Adrian's mouth opened as if an answer meant to come. Then something rose in the black below. Not all at once. First, the slick curve of a skull, then the eye. Huge, pale, inhuman. Behind Diego, the myth professor gave one broken gasp. "Kraken," he said under his breath, "not Leviathan." Then the thing below pulled harder. Corvin's hand tore loose from the rock. The black water took him whole. "Corvin!" Adrian screamed. Then the beast struck the landing. The whole chamber convulsed. Stone shrieked. A crack shot through the shelf. Above them, stalactites broke loose and came down like spears. One of the scholars froze beneath them, staring up too late. Inez moved before anyone else. Her whip cracked once through the chaos and caught the falling spike hard enough to tear it offline. It smashed against the wall in a burst of white splinters instead of driving through the myth professor's skull. He stumbled clear with a cry. "Go up!" Inez shouted. Another impact hit from below. The landing dropped under every boot, and the shelf split wider. One of Whitcomb's men vanished into the opening without finishing his scream. Another took the falling shard through the shoulder and spun into the dark. The physician went to one knee and crawled on terror alone as the stone behind him sheared away. Diego went down hard on the broken shelf, saw Adrian down and half-conscious, and moved at once. He swept Adrian up into both arms and drove uphill with him as the chamber came apart behind them. Inez reached the higher slope, lost her footing on the cracking edge, and vanished into spray and black water. The rest broke with the chamber. Falling stone, widening cracks, the lower dark swallowing shapes too fast for the eye to follow. Diego did not look back again. He climbed because there was nothing else left to do. By the time he reached the upper shelf, with Adrian burning and barely conscious in his arms, the chamber below had become a ruin of fractured rock, falling water, and black movement no human eye could read clearly. Whitcomb was gone into it. Inez was gone. Corvin was gone. The others had gone with them. Only Diego and Adrian remained above the dark.